The mountain was never intended to be a sanctuary for the heart. It was a jagged, indifferent altar where men went to sacrifice their pasts and entomb their affections. High above the huddled structures of Pine Hollow, in a realm where the gale howled with the agonizing cadence of a creature both mutilated and forsaken, Silas Blackwood stood as a solitary sentinel. He was positioned at the edge of Painted Creek, watching the frantic, frigid rush of the thaw. Though the calendar claimed it was late May, the winter refused to relinquish its grip on the shadows, where patches of stubborn snow lingered like ghosts. Here, the atmosphere was a razor, thin, piercing, and merciless. Each breath was a reminder of human insignificance, a cold blade that carved into the chest to ensure a man knew his place. Yet, Silas Blackwood did not feel diminished. At 40 years of age, he was a man forged in the twin fires of conflict and isolation. His frame was broad, his shoulders like gnarled oak, and his skin bore the textured history of a life lived at the edge of a blade. A prominent, jagged white scar tracked a path from his temple, cutting through the weathered terrain of his cheek before vanishing into the thicket of his dark beard. It was a permanent map of Antietam. A visceral memento of a day defined by the choking haze of gunpowder and the copper tang of blood, the day he had watched the light fade from his brother's eyes as he held him against a mud-slicked earth. To Silas, the mountain was a kindred spirit. It possessed a sterile, unfeeling beauty. It offered no prying questions, provided no hollow comforts, and practiced no pity. With hands rendered clumsy and numb by the glacial water, he hauled a heavy beaver trap from the creek's grasp and heaved it onto the muddy bank. He acknowledged the dull ache in his fingers only to dismiss it. He had spent years perfecting the art of the internal blackout, systematically ignoring physical agony, the erosion of memory, and the hollow echo of his own solitude. His residence was a mile's climb upward, a structure of desperation pressed so tightly against a massive slab of granite that it appeared to be burrowing into the stone to escape the sky's gaze. It was a dwelling devoid of the vanities of comfort, engineered solely for the brutal necessity of survival. Its walls were composed of massive, unpeeled logs, its windows were narrow slits designed to minimize the intrusion of the frost, and its roof was pitched low and heavy, a crouched animal bracing against the relentless wind. The interior was a minimalist's purgatory, a solitary bed, a scarred wooden table, and an omnipresent atmosphere saturated with the scent of wood smoke and curing pelts. In his younger years, Silas had never entertained the notion of a domestic life. He viewed love as a structural flaw in a man's character, a lethal vulnerability. This was a lesson he had been forced to study twice. The first lecture took place on the blood-soaked fields of Maryland, where lead tore through the bodies of young men who had sworn pathetic, boyish oaths to shield one another. The second occurred in the tamer lands of Ohio, on a sun-drenched porch where a woman named Mary had looked him in the eye and chosen the safety of paved streets and the gossip of neighbors over the savage uncertainty of the peaks. She wanted a community, he required a vacuum. He chose the silence, and for 2 decades, the silence had been his only constant companion. For 20 years, his world was defined by the rhythm of the trap line and the migration of the elk. He had reached a point where his vocal cords felt rusted from disuse, he spoke more to the whistling wind than to any living soul. The inhabitants of Pine Hollow viewed him with a mixture of suspicion and utility. They tolerated his presence because his pelts were superior and his payments were rendered in honest gold, but he was a ghost in their midst. No door was ever thrown open for him, no seat was ever pulled out at a dinner table. He was a man without a friend, and for a long time, he had convinced himself that this was his preference. However, time is the one predator no man can outrun. As the winters grew increasingly sadistic, the cold began to seep into his marrow. His joints groaned like old floorboards whenever a storm front rolled over the ridge. He was a pragmatist, and the math of his life was beginning to fail. A single slip on a patch of black ice, a fractured tibia, or a lingering lung fever in February would not be a setback, it would be a death sentence. He would rot in his cabin before the spring melt could reveal his remains. He approached the problem of his mortality with the same clinical detachment he used to set a snare. There was no room for sentiment, only the cold mechanics of necessity. He sat at his table and drafted a letter to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. He wasn't seeking a soulmate, he was seeking an insurance policy. He was looking for an extra pair of hands to stoke the fire and a witness to ensure he didn't die in total obscurity. Weeks crawled by before the post brought a collection of responses. Most were discarded immediately. Fragile sheets of parchment filled with flowery prose, desperate romanticism, and saccharine promises of eternal devotion and shared dreams. He fed those to the hearth, watching the lies curl into ash. But one letter stopped his hand. The penmanship was different, the ink had been pressed into the paper with a firm, decisive pressure that suggested a woman who knew the weight of a chore. My name is Elara Vance. I am 28 years of age. I am proficient in the kitchen and skilled with a needle. I do not come to you with expectations of affection or the whimsy of romance. My requirements are simple, honesty and a shared burden of labor. If you provide a foundation of respect, I shall provide the fulfillment of my duties. I have no illusions about the world, and I seek no fantasies. I seek only the means to endure. Silas knelt by the hearth, pried up a loose floorboard, and counted out the coins of his sequestered savings. His reply was a masterpiece of brevity, a telegram of harsh reality: come to Pine Hollow. The life here is grueling. I offer you sustenance and my protection. S. Blackwood. 2,000 miles to the east, Elara Vance sat on a hard wooden bench in a Chicago transit station, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped that scrap of paper. To her, it wasn't just a letter. It was a life raft in a sea that had already swallowed her whole. Once, she had been a woman of standing in Boston, a master seamstress whose hands were her pride and whose independence was her crown. She had built a life thread by thread, until a man of immense influence named Sterling decided that she was a commodity he wished to own. When she had the audacity to refuse his advances, he didn't just walk away. He dismantled her existence with the casual cruelty of a child pulling wings off a fly. He used his stature to poison her reputation, telling the authorities she was a thief and whispering to the social circles that she was a woman of low virtue. He branded her as dangerous to any employer who might have offered her a wage. In the gilded cages of the city, the fabricated slander of a wealthy man carried the weight of scripture, while the desperate truth of a working woman was treated as static noise. She lost her workshop, her residence, and eventually, the very dignity of her name. For Elara, the West was not a land of golden opportunity or manifest destiny, it was a dark corner of the world where a ruined woman might disappear before she was destroyed completely. The transit across the continent was a grueling descent into misery. She endured the endless, flat monotony of the plains, where the dust was a permanent fixture in her throat. She spent nights shivering in the cramped, airless confines of stagecoaches, surrounded by the judging whispers of strangers who viewed a mail-order bride as little more than a high-priced laborer or a woman fleeing a scandalous past. 3 days' journey from Pine Hollow, the veneer of civilization shattered when the stagecoach overturned in the churning waters of a swollen creek. The driver was thrown, his blood mingling with the mud as the other passengers dissolved into a chorus of useless hysterics. Elara did not scream. With a terrifyingly calm focus, she knelt in the muck, tore the fabric from her own petticoats, and bound the man's gashed thigh with steady, rhythmic precision. She spent the duration of that freezing, rain-lashed night sitting upright in the mud, keeping the man conscious through sheer force of will. She discovered in those dark hours that while she was profoundly exhausted, she was not, and would never be, weak. When the battered, mud-caked carriage finally lurched into the settlement of Pine Hollow. She descended the steps into a world of ankle-deep sludge and oppressive silence. Silas was there, waiting in the shadows of the general store's overhang. He looked less like a man and more like a mountain that had been granted the temporary gift of movement. He was imposing, his face a landscape of scars and weathered creases, his eyes dark pits beneath a heavy, brooding brow. He offered no smile, no gesture of welcome. "You?" he grunted, the word more of an interrogation than a greeting. "I am," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic drumming of her heart against her ribs. For a long, heavy minute, they simply appraised one another. Silas saw a woman who looked as though she had been hollowed out by grief, her frame slight and her eyes reflecting a profound weariness. Yet, he also saw the set of her jaw, a stubborn, unyielding line that suggested she would not break under pressure. Elara saw a predator, a man who looked capable of snapping bone without a second thought. But as she looked deeper, into the obsidian depths of his gaze, she didn't see the predatory hunger of a man like Sterling. She saw an echo of her own isolation. She saw a profound, aching loneliness. They reached out and shook hands, not a romantic gesture, but the sealing of a contract between two business partners. Inside the local mercantile, as they gathered the final supplies for the climb, the shopkeeper let out a sharp, derisive snort. He leaned over the counter, tossing a lewd glance toward Elara, and made a jagged comment about the quality of second-hand goods coming from the east. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Silas didn't laugh, and he didn't look away. He leaned over the counter until he was inches from the man's face, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl that carried the threat of a landslide. "You will address my wife with the respect she has earned," Silas commanded. The word wife hit Elara like a physical blow. In all her years of struggle, through the betrayal in Boston and the indignities of the trail, no one had ever stood as a shield for her. Not once. They began the ascent that evening. As the trail coiled tighter around the waist of the mountain, the temperature plummeted. The lights of Pine Hollow flickered and died out far below, leaving them in a world of deepening blue and gray. The cabin sat at the summit, a silent, timbered judge watching their arrival. "This is the extent of it," Silas said, gesturing to the clearing. Elara surveyed the scene, the rough-hewn logs, the chimney stained black with the soot of 1,000 fires, and the oppressive wall of the surrounding forest. It was a bleak, desolate, and terrifyingly lonely place. But as she inhaled the sharp, pine-scented air, she realized one thing: it was not Boston. Upon entering the cabin, she noted the singular bed. Silas cleared his throat, the sound rough and awkward in the small space. "The bed is yours. I'll make my place on the floor by the hearth." Elara blinked, surprised by the sudden offer of chivalry in such a rugged man. "You are the master of this house." "The husband." "I am a man who keeps his word," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on the fire he was stoking. "And I have no desire to take anything that isn't offered of a person's own free will." That night, as the mountain winds battered the shutters with the force of a battering ram, Elara lay beneath the weight of his only heavy blanket. Silas sat in a chair by the dying embers, a rifle across his knees, a silent guardian at the threshold. She fell asleep listening to the slow, rhythmic cadence of his breathing. For the first time in years, the darkness did not feel like a hiding place for monsters. She had come to the mountain expecting nothing more than a chance to survive, unaware that a far more destabilizing force was beginning to take root in that cabin: hope. The mountain did not offer a honeymoon, it offered a trial. The following morning, Elara was jolted awake before the sun had even crested the peaks by the rhythmic, echoing thud of an axe. Each strike resonated through the timber of the walls like a pulse. Stepping outside, she felt the wind shear across her skin, her breath blooming in front of her face in frantic white clouds. Silas was already deep into his labor. His shirt was plastered to his shoulder blades with sweat despite the biting frost. She watched the play of muscle beneath his scarred skin as he brought the axe down with the mechanical precision of a heartbeat. He didn't acknowledge her presence immediately. "There's coffee on the stove," he said, his voice level. "Water is in the pail by the door." It wasn't a command, nor was it unkind, it was simply the functional dialogue of the wilderness. Elara pulled her shawl tight and made her way to the creek to replenish their supply. The altitude made her head swim, and by the time she lugged the heavy bucket back to the cabin, her muscles were trembling with exhaustion. She gritted her teeth. She had not traversed half a continent to be discarded like a weakling. Their lives settled into a grueling, predictable choreography. Silas disappeared into the timber before the first light to manage his traps. Elara took over the domain of the hearth, learning the temperamental personality of the Dutch oven. She burned her fingers repeatedly, eventually learning to interpret the heat of the fire by the radiant glow against her skin rather than by sight. She scrubbed their heavy woolens in the frigid creek until her knuckles were raw and weeping. The mountain held no reverence for her past as a seamstress of fine silks, it demanded a different kind of craftsmanship, the kind that drew blood. One afternoon, Silas returned earlier than usual to find her at the woodpile. She was struggling with the heavy splitting maul, trying to force it through a stubborn, knotted log. The blade struck a knot and rebounded, the vibration traveling up her arms with enough force to nearly dislocate her shoulders. "You're trying to outmuscle it," Silas observed from the shadows of the shed. Elara spun around, breathless. "I can manage it. I never suggested you couldn't." He walked toward her, but he didn't reach for the tool. Instead, he moved behind her, his large, calloused hands covering hers on the handle. His palms were like warm stone. She could feel the radiant heat of his chest against her back as he adjusted her stance. "Don't choke the wood," he whispered near her ear. "Let the weight of the iron do the work for you." They swung the maul in unison. The log didn't just break, it detonated into two clean halves. For a heartbeat longer than necessary, he didn't pull away. She could feel the steady thrum of his life through the fabric of her dress. It wasn't the claustrophobic, predatory closeness she had fled in the East. This felt structural. It felt like an anchor. He stepped back abruptly, appearing as unsettled by the contact as she was, and retreated toward the outbuildings without another word. The mountain spring was a deception. One evening, a late-season blizzard descended with a violent suddenness. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, rattling the heavy shutters like a ghost demanding entry. Inside, the fire was a roaring beast, yet it could do nothing against the icy drafts that snaked through the chinking of the logs. Elara sat on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in every layer she possessed, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Silas watched her from his post by the fire, his expression unreadable. "This frost is going to deepen before dawn," he noted softly. "I'm all right," she lied. "No, you aren't." He hesitated, the silence stretching between them. "We need to share the bed. For the heat. That is all." Elara's pulse spiked. The last time a man had made such a promise of nothing more, it had ended in her ruin. But as she looked at Silas, she saw his hands held open, palms up, a gesture of absolute transparency. "Just for the warmth," she whispered. "On my soul," he vowed. They lay beneath the heavy firs, back to back, two rigid statues in the dark. The cabin groaned under the weight of the snow. When a particularly violent gust sent a shutter crashing against the exterior wall, Elara let out a small, involuntary gasp. In the darkness, Silas reached back. He found her hand and folded his fingers over hers. He didn't pull her closer or attempt to bridge the gap between their bodies. He simply held her hand steady. "It's only the wind, Elara," he said. She didn't let go of his hand until the sun rose. In the morning, they woke still linked, though neither mentioned the shift in their dynamic. A week later, they made the descent to Pine Hollow for essential supplies. The town had not softened in their absence. Low-register whispers trailed them like a foul scent as they entered the mercantile. A local woman pulled her child away from the aisle as Elara passed, muttering the word "harlot" just loud enough to be heard. The shame was a cold spike in Elara's chest, making her want to shrink into the floorboards. Silas didn't let her retreat. He moved with a speed that belied his size, stepping in front of the man who had chuckled at the woman's remark. "If that word passes another lip in this establishment," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal vibration, "I will ensure your jaw never functions to speak another." There was a terrifying stillness in his eyes. The room went silent. On the long ride back up the mountain, Elara watched the broad expanse of his back. "You didn't have to defend my character," she said quietly. "In this world, Elara, there are things a man must do," he replied. That was one of them. That evening, bolstered by the firelight and his quiet strength, she finally spoke of Boston. She told him about Sterling's obsession, the night she had been trapped in the sewing room, and the terrifying weight of the shears in her hand as she fought for her dignity. She told him of the lies that followed and the way the world had turned its back on her. Silas listened in total silence, though she saw his jaw tighten until the muscles corded and his knuckles turned white. When she finished, she braced for the judgment she had come to expect. Instead, he knelt on the floor before her. "You didn't just survive," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You fought. That makes you a warrior." The word "warrior" shattered her. No one had ever granted her that grace. The dam she had built inside herself for years finally gave way, and she wept with a primal, gut-wrenching force. Silas held her, not with the grip of a possessor, but with the careful tenderness of a man holding something precious and shattered. He waited. He didn't ask for anything. When she finally looked up, their faces were a breath apart. "I have a desire to kiss you," he whispered, "but only if you give me the leave to do so." "I give it," she breathed. The kiss was a slow, deliberate discovery. It was a question asked with reverence and answered with a profound, trembling certainty. For a few brief days, the cabin felt like a world unto itself, insulated from the cruelty of man. But peace on the mountain is a fragile thing. The disruption arrived in the form of a deputy on a lathered horse, bearing a parchment with the official seal of the state of Massachusetts. It was a warrant from Sterling. He had used his reach to track her down. The deputy read the charges aloud on the porch: theft, moral turpitude, and a standing reward for her return. Elara felt the blood flee her extremities. "He found me," she whispered, the nightmare of Boston closing in. Silas took the warrant from the deputy's hand, looked at it for a second, and then tossed it into the hearth. "Let them come for her," he said to the deputy. "But tell them they'll have to settle the bill with me first." In the valley, a stranger in an expensive wool coat was already distributing gold and asking pointed questions. By the weekend, the social climate of Pine Hollow had turned toxic. In the local church, the pastor preached a sermon on the infestations of sin hidden in the high places. When Silas and Elara walked through the town, people shifted their pews as if they were lepers. That night, Elara begged him to let her go. "You're going to lose everything, your home, your peace, all because of a lie told 2,000 miles away." Silas crossed the cabin in 2 strides and gripped her shoulders. "You are the only thing in this life I have ever found that was worth keeping," he said with a fierce, desperate intensity. He kissed her then. Not with the gentleness of before, but with a raw, terrified hunger. They fell onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and desperation. But as their movements grew more frantic, Silas suddenly stopped. He pulled back, his breathing ragged. "Not like this," he wheezed. "Not out of fear. I won't have our first time together be a reaction to a coward's threat." He rolled away, choosing the agony of restraint because he honored her more than his own desire. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of lead, and the stranger from the east finished assembling a posse of men who were more interested in the reward money than the law. The first true winter storm did not arrive with grace, it arrived like an executioner. The wind shredded the pines and buried the mountain passes under 6 feet of churning white powder. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the flickering light of the fire. In the isolation, they became a single organism. They were no longer a man and a woman in a contract, they were a unit. Elara mastered the snowshoes, Silas taught her how to read the sky for the coming whiteouts. One afternoon, Silas headed to the upper ridge to clear the traps before a second front moved in. He promised to be back by midday. Midday passed. Then the afternoon. By dusk, the wind was a physical force that made the logs of the cabin shiver. Elara stood at the window, her fingers trembling as she scraped away the rime of frost. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She didn't hesitate. She donned every scrap of wool she owned, grabbed a coil of heavy rope, and stepped out into the screaming abyss. The snow was a shifting, waist-deep sea. The wind erased her footprints the moment she made them. She pushed upward, her lungs burning with the thin, freezing air. She remembered his voice, watched the slopes. Listened for the hollow sound of ice. She found him near the ravine, a dark, unmoving shape pinned beneath a fallen pine and a drift of snow. "Silas!" She shrieked against the gale. She secured the rope to a sturdy larch and slid down the embankment, the brush tearing at her clothes. He was pale, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his consciousness slipping. "Go back, Elara," he rasped. "Save yourself." "I am not leaving my husband to the crows," she hissed. It took over an hour of agonizing labor to extract him. She used the rope and her own body weight to leverage him up the slope, her boots sliding on the ice as she fought for every inch. She fashioned a makeshift travois out of pine boughs and hauled him through the blinding white, her heart nearly bursting from the exertion. When they finally crossed the threshold of the cabin, she barred the door against the world and cut the frozen garments from his shivering frame. He was dangerously hypothermic. The fire wasn't enough to reach the core of him. With hands that shook from both cold and terror, Elara stripped off her own wet clothes and climbed into the furs beside him. She pressed the full length of her warmth against his freezing skin, wrapping her limbs around him. "Stay with me, Silas," she whispered into his ear. "You don't have permission to die." She spent 3 days nursing him, resetting the bone in his leg with a grim resolve, and spoon-feeding him broth as the fever burned through him. When his eyes finally cleared and the haze of pain lifted, he looked at her with a profound, quiet awe. "You risked your life for me," he whispered. "You were late for dinner," she replied, her voice cracking. The shift was final then. It was no longer about survival or debt. It was love, forged in the crucible of the mountain. By the time the snows receded and the trails opened, Silas was able to walk with the aid of a heavy cane. They rode down to Pine Hollow together, not as fugitives, but as a front. The stranger was waiting on the steps of the hall, the warrant in his hand and the sheriff at his side. "Elara Vance, you are under arrest for the theft of property from the Sterling estate," the man announced. The town gathered, a sea of judging faces. A local drifter was paid to testify that he had seen her in a parlor house in St. Louis. A miner claimed she had used charms to bewitch the hermit Blackwood. Each lie felt like a stone being cast. When Elara was called to the stand in the packed meeting hall, her voice caught in her throat. Then she felt Silas's hand, rough, warm, and steady, on her arm. She stood tall. "I did not steal his gold," she said, her voice ringing through the hall. "I stole myself back from a man who thought he could buy a soul. I used a pair of scissors to defend my virtue, and if that is a crime, then I am guilty of being a woman who refuses to be broken." The room plunged into a shocked silence. The stranger, losing his composure as his prize slipped away, lunged forward and grabbed Elara's arm with a bruising grip. Silas didn't need his cane to strike. He surged forward, shoving the man back with the strength of the mountain. A pistol shot rang out. The stranger had pulled a hidden derringer. Glass shattered. The sheriff, finally seeing the true nature of the gentleman from the east, tackled the man and pinned him to the floor. "In this territory, we don't fire on unarmed women," the sheriff growled. The judge, a man who had seen much of the world's ugliness, looked at the stranger in cuffs, and then at the couple who stood together, unyielding. He picked up the warrant and tore it in half. "The charges are dismissed for lack of credible evidence. Mrs. Blackwood is a free woman under the laws of this territory." They rode home as the sun set, casting a long, golden light over the peaks. The mountain didn't look like a place of exile anymore. It looked like a fortress. Months later, as the summer heat turned the valley emerald, Elara stood at the window with a hand pressed to her stomach. She waited for Silas to come in from the fields. When he did, she took his hand and placed it over the hidden life growing within her. "We are going to have a child," she whispered. Silas Blackwood, a man who had once believed love was a death sentence, felt his world expand. He wept with a joy so profound it washed away the last of the smoke from Antietam. The winter returned, as it always does, but when the labor pains began, the storm outside held no power. Silas stayed by her side through the long, dark hours, holding her hands and reminding her of her own strength. At the breaking of the dawn, a new sound filled the cabin, the sharp, insistent cry of a newborn son. As Silas held the child, he looked at Elara. "What shall his name be?" "Thomas," she said. "After the brother you lost." The storm broke. Sunlight flooded the ridge, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. They stood on the porch, a family silhouetted against the vast, wild sky. The world remained harsh and the wilderness remained unforgiving, but they were no longer alone. A union that had begun as a cold calculation for survival had transformed into something more enduring than the granite beneath their feet. Silas had gone to the mountain to forget what it meant to love. Instead, he had found the only woman who could teach him how to live.